He was 23 years old. He was Jewish. His parents had fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe with nothing but a suitcase. And on the morning of February 19th, 1945, on a beach where Marines had been dying for 2 hours in the black volcanic sand, he did something no manual, no officer, and no training course in the United States Marine Corps had ever prepared a man to do. He stood up in the middle of open ground with Japanese machine gunners tracking every movement. He stood up deliberately because he was carrying a weapon that most men who had seen it thought was a death trap. A weapon that had been born in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. A weapon that would earn a name of its own before that morning was over. That weapon was about to change what happened on Iwo Jima, and this young Marine, this toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, this son of Jewish immigrants who had come to America with nothing, was about to earn his nation's highest honor and pay for it with his life. This is the story of Corporal Tony Stein, and a weapon called the Stinger, and a name most Americans have never heard, the Barefoot Corporal of Iwo Jima. To understand what he did that morning, you have to understand where he came from. He was born in Dayton, Ohio, the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled anti-Semitism in the old empires of Eastern Europe and come to America with nothing but a suitcase and the desperate hope that this new country would be different. His mother, Rose, spoke with a heavy accent for the rest of her life. His father worked long hours. The family had very little, but they had a son who could look at any machine and understand it. Tony dropped out of high school, not because he was slow, because he was hungry to work. He took a job running a lathe. He learned to shape metal. He learned to think in tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch. Then he moved to Delco Products, working as a tool and die maker. By the time he was 19 years old, Tony Stein understood machines the way other men understood language. He could look at a broken piece of equipment and see in his mind exactly which part had failed and exactly how to fix it. He understood what machines could do, and more importantly, he understood what they could not do. In September of 1942, that mechanical mind, walked into a recruiting office and joined the Paramarines, the elite parachute infantry of the United States Marine Corps. He went to war on an island called Bougainville. In a single day, in the jungles of the South Pacific, Tony Stein killed 5 Japanese snipers. But it was not his marksmanship alone that would matter in the years to come. It was that mechanical mind. Because on that same island, in another company of Marines, a sergeant named Milan Grevich, called Mel by the men who knew him, had been carrying an idea in his head. Mel Grevich had watched Marines die because the Browning M1919 machine gun, the standard heavy weapon of the American rifleman, was too slow to keep up with an assault. He had watched crews break down their guns, run forward, set up again, and by the time they were firing, the moment had already passed. And Mel Grevich had done something no infantry sergeant was supposed to do. He had crawled into the wreckage of a downed Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, and he had salvaged one of its machine guns. The weapon was called the AN/M2. It was not designed for men on the ground. It was designed to be mounted inside an aircraft, firing at other aircraft cooled by high-altitude wind at 300 miles per hour. But this gun, this aircraft gun, had 2 properties that no infantry weapon in the American arsenal could match. It weighed only 21 pounds. That was 10 pounds lighter than the Browning M1919, and it could fire between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than any ground machine gun the Marines had. There was only one problem, and it was a serious one. The AN/M2 had spade grips, 2 vertical handles designed to be gripped by a pilot or a gunner sitting in an aircraft mount. There was no rifle stock, no sights that a man could aim through, no trigger a man could pull the way a man pulled the trigger of a rifle. It was a gun built for a plane, not a man. Nobody could carry it. Nobody could fire it while advancing. Nobody could aim it. Nobody, that is, until Mel Grevich carried his idea to Camp Tarawa in Hawaii in November of 1944. The Paramarines had just been disbanded. Both Grevich and Stein had been reassigned to the 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division. Grevich was in Company G, Stein was in Company A. Both companies were preparing for an operation the brass would not yet name. But everyone knew. Everyone could feel it in the air. Whatever was coming next was going to be uglier than anything they had seen before. Grevich went to work with a private first class named John Little, an armorer with steady hands and a patient mind. Together, in the maintenance sheds at Camp Tarawa, they began to build the impossible. But Grevich also needed the eye of a true toolmaker. And in Company A, he knew there was a corporal from Dayton, Ohio, who could shape metal the way a violinist shapes a note. He went to Tony Stein. He showed him the aircraft gun. He asked for his help. Stein said yes. They worked at night. In the low light of a single bulb, 3 men, 3 sets of hands, 1 broken idea taking shape in the quiet. An M1 Garand rifle stock was cut down, hollowed out, shaped to accept the buffer tube of the aircraft machine gun. A mechanical trigger was fabricated from sheet metal to replace the original solenoid so that a man's finger could do what a pilot's thumb switch had once done. The bipod from a Browning automatic rifle was welded to the front. Rear sights from another BAR were mounted so that a man could actually aim. The result was crude. It was ugly. It weighed 25 pounds. It was fed by a 100-round belt in an ammunition box, and it could empty that box in 5 seconds of continuous fire. They built 6 of them. Most of the 6 were for Company G, 3 for its rifle platoons, 1 for the demolition section, 1 for Mel Grevich himself. And one weapon that would carry a name into history it did not yet have was given to Corporal Tony Stein of Company A. They called it the Stinger. Word spread through the regiment. Marines came to look. Some of them shook the builder's hands. Some of them said the gun was brilliant. But most of them said something else. They said it was a death trap. They said the barrel would melt. They said the thing would jam on the first burst. Most Marines looked at the improvised weapon and shook their heads. They said only a fool would carry a plain gun into an infantry fight. Tony Stein said nothing. He took the Stinger to the range. He loaded a 100-round belt. He raised the crude wooden stock to his shoulder. He aimed, and he pulled the mechanical trigger. In under 6 seconds, every round in the belt was gone, and the target was in pieces. The skeptics went quiet. The company commanders approved it. The battalion approved it. Whatever the men had said in the maintenance shed at night no longer mattered. The Stinger was going to war. The night before the landing, aboard the transport ship that would carry him to Iwo Jima, Tony Stein wrote a letter home. He wrote to his wife Joan. He wrote to his mother Rose. What he put in those letters, history does not record. But every Marine on that ship wrote something that night, because every Marine on that ship knew what was coming. And every Marine on that ship knew that some of them, maybe most of them, would not be alive to write another letter home. Franklin Roosevelt was still President of the United States. He would be dead in less than 2 months, and he did not know it, and neither did the country that loved him. In Detroit, the assembly lines were still building tanks. In Kansas, the wheat was still coming in. In small towns from Vermont to California, mothers were still hanging blue star flags in their front windows and praying that a blue star would never turn to gold. This was the America Tony Stein was fighting for. This was the America he would not live to see again. The island was called Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of black volcanic rock, shaped like a pork chop sitting halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo. American bombers flying missions against the Japanese home islands needed it as an emergency landing field. To take it, the Marines would have to land on a beach of loose volcanic ash, so soft it was said to be like running through ball bearings. The Japanese commander, a 53-year-old general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had spent months preparing. He did not intend to defend the beaches. He intended to bleed the Americans dry inch by inch from a labyrinth of tunnels and pillboxes and hidden gun positions carved into the volcanic rock itself. 21,000 Japanese soldiers, 11 miles of tunnels, overlapping fields of fire that could turn any patch of open sand into a slaughterhouse. And now Tony Stein was on that beach. The tanks that were supposed to support the assault, the M4 Shermans, were bogged down in the soft ash near the waterline. They kept throwing tracks. They kept sinking. The naval gunfire was thundering overhead, but the shells could not hit what the spotters could not see. The Japanese pillboxes were camouflaged so perfectly that a Marine could look straight at one and see nothing but rock and sand. The standard Browning M1919 machine guns were doing what they had always done. They were setting up, they were firing. And then they were breaking down and trying to move forward, and by the time they moved, the momentum of the assault was already dead. This was the problem Mel Grevich had seen years earlier. This was the equation Tony Stein had helped him solve in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. And now in the black sand, with mortar rounds detonating around him and dead Marines lying scattered across the terrace beach, Tony Stein made a decision that no manual, no officer, no training course had ever prepared a man to make. He stood up. He stood up in the middle of a beach where Japanese machine gunners had overlapping fields of fire, where any Marine who raised his head was killed within seconds. He stood up, fully upright, 23 years old, and he offered his own body to the enemy as a target. Because if they fired at him, he would see their muzzle flashes. And if he could see their muzzle flashes, he could kill them. Bullets snapped past his head. Mortar rounds detonated in the ash. And Tony Stein, the toolmaker from Dayton, the son of Jewish immigrants who had come to America with nothing, lowered the crude wooden stock of the Stinger, and he waited to see where the enemy was. He saw it. A muzzle flash, a pillbox so well camouflaged with volcanic rock and sand that it looked like part of the terrain itself. Only the barrel of a Japanese heavy machine gun protruded no more than a few inches, spitting fire at the pinned-down Marines behind him. Tony Stein lowered the Stinger. He put his cheek against the crude wooden stock. He aimed, and he squeezed the trigger. The weapon came alive, 1,200 rounds per minute, a sound no man on that beach had ever heard from a hand-carried weapon. A tearing, hammering roar that seemed to come from something larger than a single Marine standing alone in the sand. 100 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition struck the camouflaged pillbox with the force of a small artillery barrage. The rock crumbled, the sandbags disintegrated. The Japanese gun fell silent. He shifted his aim. Another pillbox, another burst, 5 seconds. The concrete absorbed some of the rounds, but the sheer volume of fire was more than any man inside that structure could survive. The machine gun crew stopped shooting. They did not start again, and around Tony Stein, on that beach where Marines had been dying for 2 hours, something changed. Riflemen began to move. Sergeants, their voices hoarse from shouting into a wind of gunfire, began pushing men forward. The Marines, who had been face down in the black ash, rose up on their elbows, then their knees, then their feet. The assault, which had stalled the moment the first Higgins boat dropped its ramp, was moving again. Tony Stein charged the first pillbox. The Stinger was lighter than the standard machine guns, and he could run with it. He reached the smoking position in seconds. Inside, the enemy lay in the postures of men who had never seen death coming. The rate of fire had simply cut through everything. He moved to the second pillbox. Silence. And then the Stinger went light in his hands. He had known this moment would come. He had calculated it months earlier on a training range in Hawaii, staring at the empty belt after a demonstration burst. 100 rounds gone in less than 10 seconds of trigger time. The Stinger was devastating, and the Stinger was hungry. He looked back toward the beach. Open volcanic sand between his platoon's forward position and the ammunition supply point near the waterline, where landing craft were still trying to unload under sporadic mortar fire. Exposed ground, Japanese observers on the high ground of a mountain called Suribachi, watching every American who moved. He started running. The volcanic ash gave way under his boots. It was not sand, it was not soil, it was loose gray-black particles that swallowed a man's foot with every stride. The Marines had a name for it. They called it running through ball bearings. On the way, Tony Stein saw a wounded Marine. He did not stop. He did not slow. He bent down as he ran, grabbed the wounded Marine, hoisted him over his shoulder, and kept moving. He was carrying a man on his back, a 25-pound weapon in his hands, and 30 pounds of combat gear through volcanic ash, while Japanese mortar rounds bracketed the beach he was running toward. He reached the supply point. A corpsman took the wounded Marine from his shoulder. Stein did not wait to see if the man would live. He grabbed boxes of linked .30 caliber ammunition, and he turned around and ran back toward his platoon. Japanese snipers had begun to target the Marines moving between the beach and the forward positions. They understood now what was happening. They saw the corporal in the ash, and they knew what he was doing. A round kicked up black ash near his boot. A mortar shell detonated to his right, throwing rock and shrapnel. He did not stop. His platoon sergeant pointed. Another pillbox, this one larger, reinforced concrete. 2 previous assaults had failed against that position. Marines lay dead in the sand in front of it. Tony Stein loaded a fresh belt. He rose to his feet, and alone he walked toward the pillbox. The Japanese gun opened fire the moment he stood upright. Rounds cracked past his head. Rounds cracked past his chest. He kept walking. He raised the Stinger to his shoulder, and he opened fire. The rate of fire was so high that the Japanese gunner inside could not adjust his aim fast enough to track a single moving target. Stein's rounds walked across the firing slit and through the concrete opening. The enemy gun went silent. He charged the remaining yards, pulled a grenade from his web gear, and dropped it through the opening in the concrete. The crew inside died in the blast. He turned back to reload. The ammunition box was empty again, and the Stinger was proving something that the skeptics in Hawaii had not been able to imagine. It could destroy positions faster than any weapon on that beach, and it could burn through ammunition faster than any weapon on that beach. He started his second trip to the beach. He found more wounded Marines on the way down. He could not carry more than one at a time, so he took one, ran him to the corpsman, grabbed ammunition, went back for the next. Somewhere back in Dayton, Ohio, it was still dark. It was still the night before. In a small apartment, Rose Stein was probably asleep. Or maybe she was awake, the way mothers of Marines were often awake in those years, staring at a ceiling, listening to a clock, waiting for a letter that had not yet come. She did not know that on a beach halfway around the world, her 23-year-old son was running through volcanic sand under enemy fire. She would not know for almost 2 weeks. Back on Iwo Jima, the sun climbed higher, trip after trip, wounded Marine after wounded Marine, ammunition box after ammunition box. And somewhere in the middle of it, Tony Stein did something that, to any officer watching, would have looked like the act of a man losing his mind. He sat down for one moment in the black sand. He unlaced his boots, and he pulled them off, both of them. He set them in the ash. Then he took off his helmet, the M1 steel pot, 2.5 pounds of American steel that had been the difference between life and death for Marines all over the Pacific. He set it down. He knew every second counted. Boots and helmet were only weight. Weight would slow him down. So the weight was gone. He stood up, and he began to run barefoot through the volcanic ash. The Marines who lived through that day would later remember him by a name that would follow him into history: the Barefoot Corporal. Trip after trip, wounded Marine after wounded Marine, his feet, bare, sank into the coarse ash with every stride. His uniform was soaked with sweat and other men's blood. The weapon in his hands, the Stinger, was starting to fail him. The barrel had turned a deep purple from heat. The mechanical trigger was beginning to stick. Aircraft-grade steel was not made for prolonged ground combat. It was made to be cooled by frozen wind 3 miles above the earth. There was no wind on Iwo Jima. There was only heat and ash and the smell of burned metal. But every time the Stinger opened up, 1,200 rounds per minute of hammering thunder made the enemy hesitate. And in that hesitation, the Marines of Company A moved. When the Stinger fired, they advanced. When it went silent to reload, they went flat. No orders needed. The Marines understood. By late morning, Tony Stein had made trip after trip to the beach. He had carried wounded Marines on every return trip. He had brought back ammunition again and again. He had personally destroyed pillbox after pillbox, and the platoon that had been pinned down in the sand only hours before was now advancing inland. But the Japanese resistance was intensifying. The enemy had built a defensive network beneath the volcanic rock, pillboxes, spider holes, underground bunkers, all connected by tunnels. When one position was destroyed, the survivors would crawl through the tunnels and emerge from another position and resume firing. At one point in the fighting, Company A came up against a bunker that had already stopped the advance of other units. Reinforced concrete, multiple guns inside, tank destroyers had tried to knock it out and been driven back. An airstrike had missed. Tony Stein went forward alone. He went prone in the ash. He raised the crude wooden stock to his shoulder. He fired. And enough rounds went through the firing slits to silence the guns inside. He charged the position, dropped grenades into every opening, and left silence behind him. Company A's advance resumed. Trip after trip, the number kept growing. Marines all along the line had begun to notice the Barefoot Corporal running back and forth through the volcanic ash under fire. Some of them thought he had lost his mind. Some of them thought he was the bravest man on Iwo Jima. Tony Stein did not think about bravery. He thought about the numbers. His platoon needed ammunition. Wounded men needed evacuation. He was faster without boots. The Stinger gave him the firepower to keep the enemy heads down while he moved. Everything else was execution. At the end of the day, according to the survivor accounts collected after the battle and the Medal of Honor citation itself, Corporal Tony Stein had made 8 trips to the beach and back. He had carried wounded Marines on those trips. He had killed at least 20 Japanese soldiers, and in the citation's own quiet words, he had, quote, boldly charged the enemy pillboxes one by one and succeeded in killing 20 of the enemy during his furious single-handed assault, end quote. The Stinger, shot, overheated, mechanically abused, was still firing. That night, in a fighting hole on the volcanic slope, Japanese infiltrators began probing the American perimeter. Small groups, 2 or 3 men at a time, testing the line. Tony Stein grabbed the Stinger. When a Japanese soldier appeared in the darkness near his position, he fired a burst. The weapon still worked. The infiltrator died. By dawn on the 20th of February, Tony Stein had been awake for over 20 consecutive hours, and then the sun rose. And Company A was ordered up the volcanic slopes of Mount Suribachi. The next morning, on the slopes of that mountain, a Japanese grenade landed close to Tony Stein's position. He saw it, he tried to move, it detonated before he could get clear. Shrapnel tore into his right arm, his right leg, his torso. Multiple wounds, bleeding heavily, but not fatal. Not yet. A corpsman reached him, bandaged him, called for evacuation. Tony Stein refused. He stood up again, bleeding. His platoon was still fighting. The Stinger was still needed. So he stayed. And for hours, bleeding through his bandages, he provided fire support for the Marines climbing the mountain. Then his vision began to narrow. The corpsman told him quietly that if he did not get on a hospital ship soon, he was going to die on that slope. For the first time in 2 days of continuous combat, Tony Stein did not argue. He handed the Stinger to another Marine in his squad, and he let them carry him down the mountain to a landing craft, to a hospital ship anchored in the deep blue water off the coast of Iwo Jima. But Tony Stein's war was not over. It had not even reached its hardest hour. On the hospital ship, Tony Stein lay in a bunk. The steel walls hummed with the sound of engines. Above him, the ceiling was painted white. It was the first white ceiling he had seen in months. The doctors worked over him quietly. They pulled shrapnel fragments from his right arm, from his right leg, from his torso. They cleaned the volcanic ash out of his bare feet, the same feet that had carried him again and again across cinder sand under enemy fire. They treated him for blood loss. They treated him for infection. And when they were done, one of them looked down at the young corporal from Ohio and told him what every wounded Marine on that ship wanted to hear. He was going home. Maybe Hawaii first, maybe all the way back to the United States. But either way, he was done. His war was over. Tony Stein said nothing. He turned his head toward the porthole and he watched the ocean. For days he lay in that bunk. The wounds began to close. The strength began to come back into his hands. And in the mess of the hospital ship, in the sickbay corridors, in the quiet conversations of nurses moving from bed to bed, Tony Stein began to hear things. He heard about the 28th Marines. He heard about the flag on Mount Suribachi. He heard that a small American flag had been raised at the summit on the 23rd of February, and then later that same day a larger one had been raised as well, and a photographer named Joe Rosenthal had captured the moment on film. And that photograph would soon travel across the world and become the most famous image of the Pacific War. Tony Stein was not thinking about the flag. He was thinking about the men. News reached the hospital ship that hit Tony Stein harder than any Japanese grenade. The 5th Marine Division had moved north from Suribachi. They were now assaulting a hill in the center of the island. The fighting there was worse than the beach. The 28th Marines were being cut to pieces. Company A had lost more than half its strength. His platoon sergeant was dead. His squad leader was dead. The Marines he had trained with in Hawaii, the men who had watched him test fire the Stinger on the range, the men who had crossed the ocean with him and landed on the black sand beside him, were dying now on a nameless hill in the center of Iwo Jima. Without him, Tony Stein made a decision. He stood up. He was going back. Against the direct orders of the doctors treating him, Corporal Tony Stein climbed out of his bunk aboard the hospital ship. His feet were still bandaged, his arm was still in a sling. He walked to the deck, climbed down into a landing craft that was returning to the beach. He told the coxswain that he had been cleared to return to duty. He had not been cleared. He was leaving medical care against every medical order that had ever been given to him. But nobody stopped him. The boat carried him back to the black sand of Iwo Jima, the same beach where he had run barefoot only a week before. It looked different now, quieter. The bodies had been moved. The wreckage had been cleared. The war had moved north. He found a supply sergeant. He asked for a pair of new boots. He got them. He laced them over his bandaged feet. He winced. He walked. He asked for a rifle. He was handed an M1 Garand. The Stinger was gone. Somewhere on the island, one of the 6 weapons Grevich, Little, and Stein had helped build in the Hawaii maintenance shed was still in the hands of another Marine. Or it was destroyed, or it was buried in the ash. Tony Stein did not know, and he did not stop to ask. He started walking north, miles, across an island that had been a slaughterhouse for days. He walked past burned-out Sherman tanks abandoned in the volcanic ash. He walked past Japanese positions blown open by satchel charges and flamethrowers. He walked past Graves registration teams collecting American dead in canvas bags. He walked past the wreckage of an entire American division bleeding its way north. His feet, still bandaged, began to bleed inside the new boots. He did not stop. He walked into Company A's position at the front. The company he had left days earlier had been more than 200 men strong. It had lost more than 70% of that strength. The survivors were exhausted. They had been fighting continuously without rest. Their uniforms were black with ash and dark with old blood. Their eyes had that look that men in war eventually get, the look of men who have stopped counting. Tony Stein reported to the company commander. The commander looked at him for a moment. He knew Stein should have been on a hospital ship. He knew Stein had wounds that had not healed. He knew he could have Stein sent back. He put him on the line. Company A needed every rifle. For 2 days, Tony Stein fought in the brutal close-quarters combat around the hill. There was no Stinger now. There was only the Garand. The fighting was slower without an aircraft machine gun in his hands. It was more deliberate. Cave to cave, trench to trench, grenade after grenade. But he was still effective. He was still a Marine. He was still doing what needed to be done. And then came the 1st of March. The morning of the 1st of March, 1945, dawned clear and cool on Iwo Jima. A light wind was blowing off the Pacific. The sun was rising over the volcanic ridges to the east, casting long shadows across the ash. It was the kind of morning that in any other place on Earth might have been beautiful. Company A was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol. Their orders were not to attack. Their orders were to move forward, locate a complex of Japanese pillboxes that had been harassing the regiment's advance, and return with actionable intelligence. The patrol consisted of 19 Marines. Corporal Tony Stein was designated assistant patrol leader. They moved out from Company A's lines that morning. The terrain was volcanic ridges cut by shallow ravines. Perfect country for ambush. The Japanese had spent months preparing hidden positions all through this ground. Snipers in spider holes, machine gun nests in caves, mortar teams in concealed pits waiting. The patrol moved slowly. A short distance. Stop. Listen. Watch. Another short distance. The Marines knew that Japanese eyes were on them. The only question was when the enemy would open fire. What Tony Stein was thinking in those minutes, no one will ever know for certain. He was carrying wounds that had not healed. He was walking on feet that had not healed. He was almost certainly in pain, and he was certainly thinking, at some point, of the 2 women who were waiting for him. A wife named Joan in a small apartment, a mother named Rose in a small house in Dayton. Both of them at that hour still asleep in Ohio. Both of them still not knowing where he was. Both of them still believing because they had been told that he was safe on a hospital ship. The patrol reached a ridgeline overlooking a small valley. Tony Stein moved to the front to get a better view. He looked through the gap between 2 volcanic outcroppings. He could see what looked like camouflaged positions in the distance, possibly pillboxes. Possibly cave entrances. The patrol needed to move closer to confirm. He turned. He signaled the patrol forward. He He took one step. A single shot rang out. The bullet came from a concealed position on the ridgeline. The patrol never saw the shooter. There was no muzzle flash. There was no second shot. There was only that single crack in the morning air. The bullet struck Tony Stein in the head. He dropped instantly. The Marines around him froze for one moment. Then they moved. The nearest one reached him first and knelt in the ash and shouted for the corpsman. The corpsman came. He put his hands on the young Marine from Dayton, Ohio. He looked at the wound. He did nothing more. There was nothing to do. On the 1st of March, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein, aged 23 years, died on the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. The clear morning wind kept blowing off the Pacific. The sun kept climbing. And in a small apartment in Dayton, Ohio, a young woman named Joan Stein was probably just waking up to start her day, not knowing yet that she was already a widow. The patrol returned fire toward the ridge. Marines called in mortar support. The ground where the sniper was believed to be was saturated with high explosives. Whether the shooter was killed in the bombardment, no one ever knew. Japanese soldiers rarely left bodies where Americans could find them. The patrol completed its mission. They identified the pillbox complex. They returned to Company A with the intelligence. And they carried Tony Stein's body back with them. News of his death moved through the 28th Marines the way news of that kind always moves. Quietly. Man to man. The Barefoot Corporal, the toolmaker from Dayton, the Marine who had gone back and forth to the beach again and again on the first day. The Marine who had walked off a hospital ship to come back to his unit. Gone, he was buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. A simple wooden cross marked his grave. His name, his rank, his service number, his unit. There was no mention of the Stinger. There was no mention of the medal that would one day bear his name. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for weeks after Tony Stein was laid in the volcanic earth. When the island was finally declared secure, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead and over 20,000 more were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. The rest died in their positions or took their own lives rather than surrender. The tunnel systems beneath the island became mass graves. The 6 Stingers that Grevich and Little and Stein had helped build in that maintenance shed in Hawaii scattered across the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima and were lost. Some were destroyed. Some were lost in the chaos of equipment disposal after the war. None of them are known to exist today. They were field modifications, non-standard equipment, the kind of weapons the military typically destroys rather than preserves. Nothing was left of them but the memories of the men who had fired them and the memories of the men who had watched them fire. After the battle, Tony Stein's chain of command submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation detailed his actions on the first day of the battle. The trips to the beach, the wounded Marines carried out, the enemy positions destroyed, the barefoot runs across the volcanic ash under fire. Every officer in the chain of command endorsed it. The regiment, the division, the Fleet Marine Force, Pacific Command. Every man who read the after-action reports, every man who spoke to the survivors of Company A agreed. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April of that year, and a new president named Harry Truman had signed the recommendation into the record. On the 19th of February, 1946, exactly 1 year to the day after Tony Stein had stood up in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima and offered his body to the enemy as a target, his widow Joan Stein stood in the Ohio State House in Columbus, Ohio. She was in her early 20s. She was a young woman without her husband. Governor Frank Lausch of Ohio placed the Medal of Honor in her hands. Rose Stein, Tony's mother, the Jewish immigrant who had come to America with nothing and given her son to a country that had given her a home, sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face. Her boy, the high school dropout, the tool and die maker from Delco, had earned the highest military decoration his nation could bestow. The Medal of Honor citation described his actions. It mentioned the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon. It described how he had stood upright to draw enemy fire. It listed the pillboxes he had destroyed. It said, in the flat language of official military prose, that he had killed 20 of the enemy during his furious single-handed assault. Did not use the word Stinger. That name existed only in the oral history of the Marines who had been there. Years after the war, Tony Stein's body was brought home to Dayton. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery. Hundreds of people came to the service, veterans, family, ordinary people from Dayton who had never met Tony Stein but understood what he had represented. He remains to this day the only Medal of Honor recipient from the city of Dayton in the Second World War. Visitors still come. They leave coins on his headstone. They leave small American flags in the grass. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned a warship, a Knox-class frigate. Fast, modern, built to hunt submarines in oceans Tony Stein had never seen. The Navy named it USS Stein. It sailed the Pacific. It sailed the Indian Ocean. It served for 21 years. In 1993, it was decommissioned. Eventually, it was scrapped. But the name Tony Stein went into the permanent records of the United States Navy, alongside the names of admirals and heroes and men who had commanded fleets. At Paris Island, where new Marines have begun their service for over 100 years, instructors still teach the story of the Barefoot Corporal, the Marine who ran barefoot through volcanic ash to save his brothers. The man who walked off a hospital ship to go back to a unit that had already been broken. A firearms historian named Ian McCollum of a channel called Forgotten Weapons has documented the Stinger and its history for a modern audience. A museum has built a functional replica of the weapon for educational purposes. When they fired it for the first time, they understood, as no one who was not there could ever fully understand, what Grevich and Little and Stein had built with hand tools and scrap metal and the mind of a toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio. Military historians still debate whether the Stinger was tactically significant. 6 weapons, 1 regiment, 1 island. In the grand scale of a global war, it was almost nothing. But to the men of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, on the morning of the 19th of February, 1945, it was everything. The suppressive fire allowed advances that would otherwise have stalled. The sound of 1,200 rounds per minute kept enemy heads down at the moments that mattered most. And a Marine who might have died in the ash lived instead and went home and raised children and grew old because a corporal from Dayton, Ohio had stood up. Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had been a United States Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He had fought on 2 islands. He had killed more enemy soldiers than official records could ever count. He had helped evacuate wounded Marines under fire again and again in a single day. He had helped build, with Mel Grevich and John Little, the weapon that made all of it possible, in a maintenance shed, at night, in Hawaii, in the last quiet weeks before the deadliest island battle of the Pacific War. Because on that beach, when other men could not, Tony Stein stood up. And he never sat back down. Tony Stein has been gone for over 80 years. His mother Rose has been gone. His wife Joan has been gone. Every Marine who fought beside him on that beach has been gone. The Marines they saved have all gone home. And now, most of them, they too have gone. And that is why we tell his story tonight. Because there is only one thing left that keeps a man like Tony Stein alive, and that is his name, spoken out loud, to someone who did not know it before. So tonight, if you know the name of a man who served, a father, a grandfather, a brother, an uncle, a friend, say his name out loud, in your own home, in your own room, just his name. Because as long as his name is spoken, he is not truly gone. Next week, we tell the story of another forgotten Marine of the Pacific, a man who fought Japanese soldiers hand-to-hand in a cave for 3 days. Subscribe now so you do not miss his name either. Tony Stein, Mel Grevich. John Little, the men of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines. We remember you. We will always remember you.